As a corporate crisis manager, I handle disasters without breaking a sweat. But tonight, I was freezing inside an abandoned gas station, trapped with a complete stranger. She had piercing eyes that saw right through my expensive suit and my perfectly constructed lies. I swore I didn't need her help. Then, the last fluorescent bulb violently shattered. The lights went out completely. And in the absolute dark, I felt her grab my waist.
"Amy, how are you?" Route 50 Inches, Nevada is famously called the loneliest road in America. I never truly understood the weight of that title until my engine died right in the middle of it. The dashboard of my rented sedan lit up with a barrage of warning symbols. A harsh, metallic, grinding noise ripped through the chassis before the car simply gave up. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white against the leather. "Logically speaking, this isn't happening," I muttered to the empty cabin. I am a crisis management director based in Los Angeles. My entire career is built on the premise that no disaster is unfixable if you attack it with enough money and logic. But no amount of strategic PR was going to fix a blown transmission in the absolute dead center of a high desert dust storm. Outside the windshield, the world was a swirling, opaque wall of orange and brown sand. The wind howled against the glass, violently rocking the car on its suspension. I checked my phone, watching the single bars of service vanish into a mocking no signal. My chest tightened, a familiar cold weight settling just beneath my ribs. I had a board meeting in 12 hours to save a tech CEO from his own stupidity. I could not be stranded here. Through the dense haze of the storm, a flickering neon sign barely pierced the gloom. It was a decaying gas station, sitting alone on the edge of the asphalt like a forgotten relic. I grabbed my briefcase, shoved open the car door, and was immediately hit by a wall of abrasive wind. Sand bit into my skin and immediately ruined my tailored charcoal suit. I kept my head down, forcing my way through the violent gusts toward the concrete island. The glass door of the convenience store resisted for a moment before I shoved it open with my shoulder. A tarnished brass bell above the frame announced my arrival with a pathetic, hollow chime. I stumbled inside, slamming the door shut against the howling storm, and leaned back against the glass. I dragged a sharp breath into my dust-coated throat, trying to regain my composure. The interior smelled of stale coffee, ancient motor oil, and the dry rot of desert wood. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering unsteadily as the wind battered the roof. "Don't bother with the landline behind the counter." The voice was low, slightly raspy, and completely unbothered. I snapped my head toward the shadows at the far end of the store. Sitting on top of a dormant ice cream freezer was a woman. She had one knee pulled up to her chest, an old film camera resting casually on her thigh. She wore a scuffed, vintage leather jacket that looked like it had survived a war, layered over a faded black t-shirt. Her hair was cut in a messy, deliberate wolf cut, the dark strands falling carelessly around her face. But it was her eyes that pinned me to the spot. They were a striking, piercing gray-blue, observing me with the calm detachment of a predator watching a frantic bird. "The phone lines came down 20 minutes ago," she added, her tone incredibly smooth. I straightened my posture immediately, brushing the dirt off my lapels in a futile attempt to look professional. "There has to be a backup radio or a tow service number," I said, my voice sharp and rapid. I walked behind the abandoned register, my heels clicking aggressively against the linoleum floor. The store clerk was nowhere to be found, probably having abandoned the sinking ship hours ago. I picked up the heavy plastic receiver of the landline, only to hear the heavy silence of a dead connection. I slammed it back onto the cradle, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet store. "I can fix this," I whispered to myself, more of a habit than a reality. I pulled out my cell phone again, holding it high in the air as if sheer willpower could summon a satellite. The woman on the freezer let out a quiet, rough sound that might have been a laugh. You're wasting your battery, she noted. I dropped my arm and leveled a cold glare in her direction. I wasn't asking for a consultation, I replied, my defense mechanisms snapping into place. She simply tilted her head, thick silver rings catching the flickering light as she adjusted the lens of her camera. Just stating a fact, she murmured. She hopped down from the freezer, her boots making a soft thud against the floor. She moved with an infuriating amount of ease, a slow, deliberate saunter that ate up the space between us. She stopped on the other side of the counter, leaning her forearms against the scratched formica. Up close, the scent of petrichor, cedar, and something distinctly metallic clung to her jacket. Her gaze dropped slowly from my tense jaw down to my hands, which were unconsciously twisting my silver watch strap.
You look like you're about to vibrate through the floor, she observed, a faint smirk playing on her lips. I am currently missing a flight out of Salt Lake City that I am already late for, I clipped, refusing to break eye contact. The interstate is closed in both directions due to zero visibility, she said, her voice dropping a fraction lower. She reached out, a calloused, long-fingered hand tapping the edge of a dusty road map on the counter. Nobody is coming out here, and nobody is leaving. I felt a fresh spike of adrenaline hit my bloodstream. I opened my briefcase on the counter, pulling out a secondary satellite phone I kept for extreme emergencies. As I pulled it out, a sleek, white business card slipped from the leather pocket and fluttered to the floor. Before I could bend down, she smoothly crouched and picked it up. She read the embossed lettering, her eyes flicking back up to mine. Elena Vance, she read aloud, letting the syllables roll slowly over her tongue. The way she said my name felt entirely too intimate for a desolate gas station. Crisis manager, she continued, standing back up and holding the card loosely between her index and middle finger. Well, Elena, welcome to your own crisis. I snatched the card from her hand, our fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. Her skin was startlingly warm against my freezing, rigid hands. I don't believe we've been introduced, I said, my tone dripping with icy formality. Rowan, she replied, slipping her hands into the pockets of her leather jacket. Rowan Hayes. She didn't offer her hand to shake, seemingly knowing I wouldn't take it anyway. Listen, Rowan, I started, adopting the authoritative tone I use to handle panicked executives. I appreciate the grim outlook, but logically speaking, the highway patrol patrols this route. I gripped the edge of the counter, leaning in slightly. We just need to wait for the storms break, flag them down, and arrange an extraction. Rowan just stared at me, her expression unreadable, though a dangerous glint danced in her gray-blue eyes. You really don't know how to stop fighting, do you? She asked softly. The question hit me harder than I expected, bypassing my professional armor and sinking right into my ribs. I opened my mouth to fire back a sarcastic retort. Before I could form the words, a massive gust of wind slammed into the building. The rusted metal roof groaned violently under the pressure. The fluorescent lights above us buzzed one final, desperate time. Then, with a loud pop, the bulbs shattered, and the entire gas station plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. I gasped, my hands instinctively gripping the edge of the counter so hard my fingernails bit into my palms. The silence inside the store was sudden and heavy, save for the muffled roaring of the wind outside. I couldn't see my own hands. I couldn't see the door. Rowan? I said, hating the slight tremor that betrayed my voice. There was a metallic click. A small, bright yellow flame flared to life inches from my face. Rowan held a silver Zippo lighter, the small fire casting deep, dancing shadows across her sharp jawline. Her eyes were fixed entirely on me, the warm light reflecting in her irises. She stepped around the counter, closing the physical distance between us until she was just a breath away. Take a breath, Vance, she murmured, her voice a low vibration in the darkness. She snapped the lighter shut.
The darkness swallowed us completely, but I could still feel the heat of her standing right in front of me. And for the first time in my life, I had absolutely no idea what to do next. The darkness did not just fill the room, it swallowed it whole. For several agonizing seconds, the only sound in the universe was the frantic, uneven rhythm of my own breathing. My vision swam with phantom static as my eyes desperately tried to find a focal point that didn't exist. I hated the dark. It was the ultimate loss of control, a variable you simply could not manage or negotiate with. "Turn it back on," I demanded, hating how my voice sounded thinner, lacking its usual boardroom authority. A low, soft exhale came from the pitch black directly in front of me. "Say please, Vance," Rowan murmured, the raw gravel in her voice vibrating through the space between us. I bit down on the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste copper. "Logically speaking, we need a light source to assess the inventory of this establishment," I snapped, deflecting her taunt. The sharp, metallic snick of the Zippo echoed again. The yellow flame erupted, casting Rowan's face in stark relief against the surrounding shadows. She wasn't smiling, but there was a distant, infuriating amusement swimming in her gray-blue eyes. "Inventory," she repeated slowly, testing the corporate word as if it left a strange taste in her mouth.
She held the lighter up, casting a meager circle of illumination over the dusty aisles. "Right? Let's go do an audit, Madam Director." She turned away, the faint scent of rain and old leather washing over me as she moved. I stood frozen for a second, my hands still gripping the edge of the Formica counter. "Are you coming, or do you prefer to wait for corporate rescue in the dark?" she called over her shoulder. I swallowed my pride, grabbed my useless briefcase, and hurried after the small halo of her lighter. The temperature inside the store was dropping at an alarming rate. High desert environments were notorious for their freezing nights, and the howling storm outside was rapidly stripping away the building's residual heat. My tailored charcoal suit, perfectly adequate for a climate-controlled LA office, was practically paper-thin against the creeping chill. I shivered, my shoulders drawing up toward my ears as we navigated the narrow aisles of expired snacks. Rowan moved with the silent, fluid grace of someone entirely comfortable in their own skin. She stopped in front of a hardware display, scanning the rusted shelves with her Zippo. "Bingo," she whispered, her hand shooting out into the shadows. She pulled down a heavy, yellow industrial flashlight, its rubber casing coated in a thick layer of grime. She clicked the heady button on its side. A powerful, blinding beam of white light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the swirling dust motes in the air. I instinctively shielded my eyes with my forearm. "Much better," Rowan said, snapping the Zippo shut and slipping it back into her pocket. She swung the beam around, painting the desolate reality of our situation. Water-stained ceiling tiles, shattered display racks, and a heavy metal door marked "Implies use only" at the back of the store. "The front windows are single-pane glass," Rowan observed, aiming the light at the violently rattling storefront. "If the wind picks up any more debris, they are going to shatter." I followed her gaze, watching the glass bow inward under the immense pressure of the storm. A fresh wave of anxiety tightened my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. "We need to relocate to an interior room," I stated, shifting into my crisis management mode. "Brilliant deduction," Rowan replied dryly. She aimed the flashlight toward the back door and gestured with her chin. "After you." I walked ahead of her, painfully aware of the sharp clicking of my heels echoing off the linoleum. The sound felt ridiculous in the context of survival, a glaring reminder of how utterly out of place I was. "You should take those off," Rowan noted, the flashlight beam tracking my steps from behind. "I am perfectly capable of walking," I replied stiffly, refusing to abandon the last physical remnant of my professional armor. "Suit yourself," she said, her tone utterly indifferent. I reached the metal door, turning the heavy, tarnished knob.
It resisted at first, but with a hard shove it groaned open, revealing a cramped back office. The air inside was stale, smelling strongly of old paper, damp insulation, and dust. Rowan stepped in behind me, sweeping the flashlight across the small space. It contained a rusted metal desk, a few overturned filing cabinets, and a sagging, cracked leather sofa pushed against the far wall. Crucially, there were no windows. "It's a bunker," Rowan said, sounding almost approving. She walked over to the desk, setting the flashlight down so the beam bounced off the ceiling, bathing the room in a diffuse, eerie glow. I set my briefcase on the only upright filing cabinet and immediately began pacing the tight 4-foot stretch of floor. My mind was racing, cataloging variables, calculating timelines, structuring contingency plans. If the storm broke by dawn, I could hike to the nearest mile marker. If I found a landline junction box, maybe I could splice a connection. "You're burning oxygen, Vance." Rowan's voice sliced through the frantic buzzing in my head. I ignored her, making another sharp turn on my heels, my knuckles white as I twisted my silver watch strap. "Logically speaking, the Nevada Department of Transportation must have sensors on this route," I muttered, more to myself than to her. "If the traffic flow drops to 0, it triggers an anomaly report." Rowan was sitting on the edge of the desk, one leg swinging idly, watching me with that heavy, predatory gaze. "Elena," she said. I kept pacing. "And if they dispatch a road crew, they'll start from the nearest grit town, which is roughly—" "Elena?" Her voice was sharper this time, carrying a quiet command that made my steps falter for a microsecond. I didn't stop. "Which is roughly 30 miles east, assuming a standard plowing speed." Suddenly, a warm, calloused hand clamped around my wrist. The physical contact was so unexpected, so grounding, that it stopped me dead in my tracks. Rowan had moved off the desk without me even noticing. She was standing directly in my path, towering over me by a few inches, her grip firm but not bruising. Her skin was radiating heat against my freezing wrist, a shocking contrast to the frigid air in the room. I stared down at her hand, my brain temporarily short-circuiting. "You are spiraling," she said softly, her thumb brushing a fraction of an inch against my frantic pulse point. I yanked my hand back, stepping away as if I had been burned. "I am analyzing our strategic options," I snapped, my voice trembling entirely against my will. Rowan didn't step forward, but her presence seemed to expand, filling the suffocating little room. "You are panicking," she corrected, tilting her head. "And your teeth are chattering." I pressed my lips together tightly, mortified to realize she was right. The cold had fully seeped into my bones, causing a fine, uncontrollable tremor to run through my shoulders. Before I could form a defensive reply, Rowan was shrugging out of her vintage leather jacket. She wore only a thin, faded black t-shirt underneath, which clung nice into the lean, defined lines of her shoulders. She held the heavy jacket out to me. "I don't need your charity," I said, my pride making a desperate, foolish stand. Rowan sighed, an exasperated sound, and stepped into my personal space. Without waiting for my permission, she draped the heavy leather over my shoulders. The jacket was incredibly heavy, lined with worn fleece, and it carried the intense, overwhelming body heat of Rowan Hayes. The scent of her, cedar, rain, and that faint metallic tang, enveloped me completely, short-circuiting my defensive reflexes. "It's not charity, it's thermodynamics," she murmured, her face inches from mine, as she pulled the lapels closer around my neck. I looked up, my breath catching as my dark eyes locked with her gray-blue ones. The diffuse light from the ceiling cast deep shadows beneath her cheekbones, making her look dangerous and intensely beautiful. For a long, suspended moment, neither of us moved. The silence between us grew heavy, thick with a tension that had absolutely nothing to do with the freezing temperature. I could feel the ghost of her knuckles brushing my collarbone. "Sit on the couch, Vance, before your expensive shoes give out," she commanded softly, finally stepping back. I obeyed, my legs suddenly feeling like water, and sank into the cracked leather of the old sofa. Rowan retrieved the flashlight from the desk and walked over, sitting down right next to me. The sofa was too small. Her thigh pressed solidly against mine, a long, uninterrupted line of heat burning through the fabric of my trousers. I stiffened, my instincts screaming at me to pull away, to maintain professional distance. But the room was freezing, and the warmth radiating from her was intoxicatingly necessary. I stayed completely still, hyper-aware of the steady rise and fall of her chest beside me. Rowan turned off the heavy flashlight to conserve battery, plunging us back into the suffocating darkness. The only light was the faint, ambient glow creeping in from under the door, cast by the distant lightning of the storm. We sat in silence, the physical boundary between us blurred by the heavy leather jacket and the absolute dark. I closed my eyes, trying to mentally rebuild the walls she was so effortlessly tearing down. Then, a massive, deafening crack echoed from the front of the store. The entire building shuddered violently, as if a truck had slammed into the facade. I jolted, a sharp gasp escaping my lips as panic flooded my system. In the pitch black, an arm shot out, wrapping securely around my waist and pulling me hard against a solid chest. "Hold still," Rowan whispered fiercely, her breath hot against my ear as the sound of shattering glass tore through the night. The sound of shattering glass tore through the night, followed by the vicious howl of the desert storm breaching the storefront. In the pitch black, my entire universe was reduced to the crushing grip of Rowan's arm around my waist. She had pulled me sideways, burying my face against the heavy cotton of her black t-shirt. My hands were flat against her chest, fingers instinctively curling into the fabric as the building shook. Beneath my palms, I could feel the steady, infuriatingly calm rhythm of her heartbeat. It was a stark contrast to my own heart, which was hammering violently against my ribs like a trapped bird. The chaos in the main store raged on for several terrifying seconds. Metal shelving crashed to the floor, and debris hammered against the heavy metal door of our bunker. Then, the terrifying crescendo slowly dialed back down into the steady, oppressive roar of the wind. We were safe.
Rowan didn't let go immediately. For a long, agonizing moment, we stayed locked together in the suffocating darkness. I was acutely aware of her chin resting near my temple and the heat of her breath stirring my hair. The primal terror of the crash was quickly being replaced by a completely different kind of panic. I abruptly pushed myself back, my hands shoving against her collarbone to break the contact. Rowan let her arm drop without resistance, the sudden absence of her body heat leaving me inexplicably cold. "I'm fine," I said immediately, my voice sounding incredibly loud and defensive in the small room. The sharp click of the heavy flashlight echoed, and the blinding white beam cut across the floor. Rowan aimed the light away from our faces, letting it reflect off the rusted filing cabinets. She stood up from the sofa with that same effortless grace, walking over to inspect the metal door. "A piece of debris blew out the front windows," she reported, running her hand along the doorframe. "The wind pressure is trapped in the main store now." She turned back to face me, leaning her shoulder against the metal panels. "If we open this door, the suction will likely rip it off its hinges." I pulled her heavy leather jacket tighter around my shoulders, my fingers gripping the fleece lining. "So we are effectively sealed inside a 10 by 10 utility closet," I summarized, my chest tightening again. "Logically speaking, yes," Rowan replied, throwing my own phrase back at me with a faint smirk. She walked back to the sofa, sitting down just a few inches further away than she had been before. She set the flashlight on the floor between her boots,
casting long, dramatic shadows upward. The adrenaline crash hit me then, a brutal wave of exhaustion that made my hands shake violently. I crossed my arms tightly, staring at a water stain on the ceiling to avoid looking at her. "Who is the tech CEO?" Rowan asked suddenly, her voice low and conversational. I blinked, pulling my gaze away from the ceiling to look at her in confusion. "Excuse me?" "Before the lights went out, you were vibrating out of your shoes over a flight you missed," she reminded me. She leaned back against the cracked leather, stretching her long legs out in front of her. "You said you were late. Who were you rushing to save, Elena?" The sound of my name on her lips was still entirely too smooth, too familiar. "That is strictly confidential client information," I replied, my professional armor automatically snapping back into place. Rowan let out a soft, rough chuckle that did strange things to the base of my spine. "We are trapped in a literal metal box in the middle of a wasteland, Vance." She turned her head to look at me, her piercing gray-blue eyes catching the ambient light. "I don't think the SEC is listening at the door." I clenched my jaw, hating the fact that her logic was flawless. "His name is irrelevant," I muttered, the fight suddenly draining out of my voice. "He's a 20-something billionaire who tweeted something wildly offensive, and his board is about to oust him." I uncrossed my arms, dragging a tired hand through my perfectly styled, now ruined hair. My job was to fly in at dawn, confiscate his phone, and draft an apology that sounded adequately remorseful. "Sounds exhausting," Rowan observed quietly. "It's lucrative," I corrected sharply, defending the career that consumed my entire existence. "Money doesn't keep you warm at night, Madam Director." The casual intimacy of the remark felt like a physical intrusion. I turned my body slightly toward her, my defensive instincts flaring into anger. "And what about you, Hayes? What does a freelance documentary photographer actually do?" I let a healthy dose of dry sarcasm drip into my tone. "Do you just wander around desolate highways waiting for tragedies to capture on vintage film?" I expected her to bristle, or at least offer a sarcastic retort. Instead, Rowan just watched me, completely unfazed by my hostility. "I look for things that most people try to ignore," she said simply. She reached into her pocket, pulling out the silver Zippo lighter, flipping the lid open and closed rhythmically. Clink, clink, clink. People lie with their words all the time, Elena, especially people like you. The accusation hung heavy in the freezing air between us. But people can't lie in a photograph. A lens captures exactly what you are trying to hide. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to look away from her, as if her gray-blue eyes were camera lenses stripping me down. "I'm not hiding anything," I lied smoothly, lifting my chin. Rowan stopped flipping the lighter. She shifted her weight, sliding closer on the sofa until our knees were nearly touching. The ambient heat of her body was a magnetic pull in the freezing room.
"You make a living fixing other people's disasters, Vance," she murmured, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Because it's a lot easier than looking at your own." My breath hitched, a sharp spike of anger and raw panic flooding my chest. She had known me for less than an hour, and she was already tearing out the foundational wires of my life. "You know absolutely nothing about me," I snapped, my voice finally trembling with genuine emotion. "I know that you are sitting here wearing a tailored suit that probably costs more than my car." She leaned in, the scent of cedar and rain washing over me again. "I know that you use big words to build walls." Her gaze dropped to my hands, which were twisting together in my lap. "And I know that you are terrified of sitting still for more than 5 minutes." I wanted to stand up, to yell at her, to storm out into the hurricane of dust and glass. But there was nowhere to go. We were trapped in this box, and she had me completely cornered. "Stop analyzing me," I commanded, though it sounded more like a desperate plea. Rowan didn't back down. Instead, she slowly raised her hand, her long, calloused fingers hovering just an inch from my cheek. She didn't touch me, but the phantom heat of her hand felt like a brand against my freezing skin. "I'm not analyzing you, Elena," she said softly, the gravel in her voice doing terrifying things to my pulse. "I'm just finally getting a good look at you." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't formulate a logical response. The overwhelming urge to lean forward, to close that agonizing 1-inch gap and rest my face in her palm, was violently fighting against every instinct I had left. Before I could surrender to either impulse, the flashlight on the floor suddenly flickered. It blinked twice in rapid succession, casting strobe light shadows across Rowan's intense features. Then, the bulb completely died. The darkness returned, absolute and suffocating. But this time, I wasn't alone in the void. I was trapped inches away from a woman who saw right through my armor, and the silence between us was deafening. The sudden death of the flashlight felt like a physical blow to my chest. The heavy, suffocating blackness crashed over us once again, but this time, it felt entirely different. I could no longer see Rowan, but her presence was a crushing, magnetic weight in the tiny room. My breath hitched, sounding loud and erratic against the steady howling of the wind outside. The temperature in the back office had plunged past uncomfortable and straight into dangerous. The desert night was actively draining the life out of my bones, seeping through the thin wool of my trousers. I shivered violently, a full-body tremor that started in my jaw and rattled down to my freezing toes. I clamped my mouth shut, terrified that my chattering teeth would betray just how close I was to breaking. "You are going to freeze to death out of pure stubbornness," Rowan's voice floated out of the void. It wasn't a taunt this time. It was a dark, unavoidable statement of fact. "I am adequately insulated," I lied, my voice shaking so badly the words barely formed. The cracked leather of the sofa groaned loudly as Rowan shifted her weight in the dark. "I am done playing this game, Elena." The use of my first nar sent a dangerous, electric shockwave straight down my spine. Before I could formulate a logical protest, hands were on me. Calloused, firm hands grabbed my breast, ignoring the expensive tailoring of my clothes. She pulled me. It was not a gentle suggestion, but a smooth, undeniable display of physical dominance. I slid across the remaining few inches of the sofa, crashing directly into her solid frame. My palms hit her chest instinctively, flattening against the soft, worn cotton of her t-shirt. She was radiating heat like a furnace, an overwhelming contrast to the freezing air around us. "Get your hands off me," I choked out, though my fingers completely failed to push her away. "Logically speaking," Rowan murmured, her breath grazing the sensitive shell of my ear, "you need my body heat to avoid hypothermia. Stop fighting your own survival." I hated her flawless logic. I hated even more that she was using my own defense mechanism as a weapon against me. She adjusted her position in the dark, pulling her long legs up and trapping mine beneath hers. We were hopelessly tangled, a messy knot of limbs enveloped in the heavy leather jacket she'd given me. Rowan pulled the edges of the oversized jacket tight around both of us, creating a sealed pocket of warmth. Her arms wrapped securely around my back, holding my freezing body flush against hers. There was not a single millimeter of breathable space left between us. I was completely trapped, pinned by her strength and the absolute darkness. And God help me, it felt absolutely incredible. I stayed completely rigid for exactly 3 minutes. My muscles ached and burned from the effort of maintaining my defensive professional posture. But the cold was a relentless enemy, and Rowan Hayes was the only shelter in a 100-mile radius. Slowly, agonizingly, my physical body betrayed my highly trained mind. My rigid shoulders finally dropped, the tension bleeding out of me in a heavy sigh. My spine curved forward, naturally molding into the accommodating lines of her body. I let my forehead drop, resting the bridge of my nose against the warm hollow of her collarbone. Rowan let out a long, quiet exhale, her chin resting gently on the top of my head. She began moving her hands up and down my spine, creating a slow, deliberate friction. The sensation was terrifyingly electric, overriding the freezing temperature in the room. Every time her palms pressed into the small of my back, a fresh wave of heat pooled in my stomach. "Why are you always running, Vance?" she asked softly into the dark, her voice a low rumble against my ear. The question bypassed my usual corporate defenses, slipping effortlessly through the cracks she had just forced open. In the bright lights of a boardroom, I would have deflected instantly. I would have used my title, my six-figure salary, and my intellect as an impenetrable shield. But the dark was a brutal equalizer, stripping away the luxury and the titles until only raw nerve endings remained. "Because if I stop, everything collapses," I whispered, the admission tasting like dry ash in my mouth. The slow, rhythmic movement of her hands on my back paused for a fraction of a second. "Who collapses? The billionaires?" she asked, a trace of genuine curiosity replacing her usual sarcasm. "Me," I confessed, the singular word slipping out of my throat before my brain could stop it. I squeezed my eyes shut, mortified by my own sudden, bleeding vulnerability. "I spent 10 years building this specific version of myself," I continued, my voice barely above a breath. I pressed my face deeper into her jacket, hiding in the scent of cedar and rain. "The version that doesn't feel anything. The version that only executes and solves." Rowan shifted slightly, bringing her right hand up from my waist to the nape of my neck. Her long fingers tangled gently in the short, heavily styled hair at the base of my stall. "Sounds like a deeply miserable way to live," she murmured. "It's safe," I argued blindly, though the word felt incredibly hollow against the steady beating of her heart. "Is it?" Her thumb began a slow, rhythmic circle against my frantic pulse point on my neck. The touch was intoxicating, blurring the line between comfort and a very dangerous kind of claiming. "You are sitting in a metal box, shivering, clinging to a complete stranger." Her voice dropped to register, vibrating with a dark, heavy gravity. "Your perfectly planned life just imploded over a broken transmission, Elena. Control is an illusion." I tilted my head up in the absolute dark, acting purely on a blind, desperate impulse. I wanted to find her face, to challenge her, to prove I was still in charge of something. Instead, in the pitch black, my nose brushed directly against the rough, warm skin of her jawline. She froze instantly. The casual, untouchable confidence completely vanished from her posture in a split second. The air in the tiny room suddenly felt impossibly thick, heavy with a suffocating, static charge. I could feel the sharp, ragged intake of her breath against my collarbone. I could feel the immediate, rigid tensions spiking in the muscles of her back. I should have pulled away immediately. I was a crisis manager. I knew exactly how to de-escalate a rapidly deteriorating situation. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, refusing to retreat a single inch. My lips were hovering a fraction of an inch from the skin of her neck, so close I could taste the salt and heat of her. "If control was an illusion," I whispered, my voice dropping into a raspy register I didn't even recognize as my own, "then what is this?" Rowan's hand tightened in my hair, a sudden possessive grip that sent liquid fire straight to my core. "This," she breathed, her voice completely stripped of its usual mocking tone, replaced by raw, predatory hunger, "is you finally waking up?" She tilted her head down in the dark. I felt the soft flutter of her eyelashes brush against my cheekbone. The physical proximity was maddening,
a psychological torture of the highest degree. My entire body was pulled taut as a wire, anticipating the absolute ruin of her lips on mine. But she didn't close the final gap. She kept me suspended in that agonizing millimeter of space, letting the raw, unspeakable tension torture us both. "Tell me to stop, Vance," she commanded, the gravel in her voice darker, infinitely more dangerous now. Her thumb pressed firmly against the erratic flutter of my pulse.
"Tell me to let you go and I will back away. Right now." Every logical circuit in my brain was screaming at me to say the word. To end this madness, to restore the professional boundaries, to save myself from this terrifying freefall. But my hands, which had been resting passively against her chest, suddenly moved with a mind of their own. I gripped the soft fabric of her t-shirt, my knuckles turning white in the dark. I pulled her closer, aggressively eliminating the last breathable space between our bodies. "No." The single, defiant syllable hung in the freezing air between us, vibrating with the weight of a death sentence. I had just handed over the keys to my own destruction. Rowan did not move immediately. For 3 agonizing heartbeats, the only sound in the suffocating darkness was the violent roaring of the wind outside. Then she shifted. The subtle movement of her body against mine sent a fresh, blinding wave of heat straight into my chest. Her hand, which had been resting firmly on the nape of my neck, slid slowly upward. Long, calloused fingers tangled themselves deeply into my ruined hair, gripping the short strands with a possessive strength. She tilted my hat back slightly, exposing the long, vulnerable column of my throat to the freezing air. But I didn't feel the cold. I only felt the intense, radiating heat of her breath ghosting across my skin. "Careful, Vance," she whispered, her voice dropping an entire octave, morphing into a raw, gravelly purr. "When you take the leash off a predator, you don't get to dictate how it hunts." The threat was explicit, yet it sent a treacherous, electric thrill straight down my spine. Every alarm bell in my highly trained, rigidly structured brain was screaming at me to evacuate. My job was to mitigate risk, to assess danger, to neutralize threats before they could do any real damage. But sitting here in the dark, trapped under the heavy weight of her vintage leather jacket, I was the one entirely neutralized. I swallowed hard, a purely involuntary reflex, and felt the sharp glide of her thumb trace the edge of my jawline. Her touch was agonizingly slow, a deliberate exploration of a territory she clearly intended to conquer. The rough pad of her thumb mapped the sharp angle of my bone, moving upward until it brushed the corner of my mouth. I gasped softly into the dark, my lips parting instinctively against her skin. Rowan let out a low, approving hum that vibrated through her chest and straight into mine. "You are shaking, Elena," she murmured, her face moving even closer. I could feel her eyelashes grazing my cheek again. "Is it the cold? Or is it me?" "Logically speaking," I started, my voice failing entirely, coming out as a fractured, breathless whisper. "To hell with logic," she cut in sharply, her tones stripping away the last of my corporate defenses. She leaned in, decisively erasing the final millimeter of space between us. But she didn't kiss me. Instead, she buried her face in the curve of my neck, pressing her warm forehead against my freezing pulse point. The sheer intimacy of the gesture was more devastating than any kiss could have been. It was a profound, suffocating closeness that bypassed my physical armor and went straight for my blood. I was drowning in the scent of her, rich cedar, sharp ozone from the storm, and the dark, heavy musk of warm skin. My hands, still gripping the soft cotton of her t-shirt, pulled her impossibly tighter against me. I felt her lips brush against the sensitive skin just below my earlobe. Not a kiss, just a brush.
A devastatingly gentle, terrifyingly precise touch that sent a violent shudder through my entire frame. "You try so hard to hold the world together," Rowan whispered against my skin, her breath hot and damp. "But you are falling apart right here in my arms." Tears prickled the back of my eyes, hot and entirely uninvited. She was right. I was a 29-year-old executive who commanded boardrooms and terrified billionaires. But right now, I was just a woman breaking apart in the dark, begging silently for a stranger to put me back together. Her hands slid from my hair down to my waist, her grip tightening, pulling me flush against her hips. The heavy friction of her body against mine sent a pooling, liquid heat directly to my core. My breath hitched into a ragged sob that I violently choked back down. She was consuming me. She was stripping away the title, the suit, the sarcasm, and the money, leaving absolutely nothing but raw, exposed nerve endings. And suddenly, the terrifying reality of that exposure hit my conscious mind like a freight train. If I let her pull me entirely into the dark with her, the Elena Vance I had spent a decade building would cease to exist. I would lose the control I desperately needed to survive.
I would be vulnerable. I would be known. Panic, sharp and blinding, clawed its way up my throat, instantly turning the intoxicating heat into suffocating terror. My survival instincts, dormant for the last 10 minutes, violently reawakened. Before my brain could even fully process the command, my body reacted. I shoved her. I planted both palms flat against her chest and pushed with every single ounce of strength I had left. The movement was abrupt, violent, and entirely unexpected. Rowan was thrown backward, her grip breaking as she hit the rusted armrest of the sofa with a heavy thud. I scrambled backward in the dark, my heels catching on the cracked leather as I pushed myself to the furthest opposite corner. I hit the cold, unyielding metal of a filing cabinet and curled my knees to my chest, gasping for air as if I had been underwater. The heavy leather jacket slipped from my shoulders, falling to the floor between us like a discarded truce. The freezing temperature of the room slammed back into me instantly, biting into my exposed skin with brutal force. For a long time, the only sound was our heavy, erratic breathing competing with the howling desert wind. I wrapped my arms tightly around my own ribs, trying physically to hold my shattered pieces together. "Don't," I choked out, my voice trembling with a mixture of profound fear and immediate, crushing regret. I couldn't see her in the absolute pitch black, but I could feel the intense, heavy silence radiating from her side of the sofa. She didn't move toward me. She didn't reach out. "Don't what, Vance?" Rowan finally asked. Her voice wasn't angry. It was far worse than angry. It was completely flat, entirely devoid of the playful, predatory warmth from just a moment ago. "Don't do this," I whispered, my fingernails digging painfully into the fabric of my suit sleeves. "Don't pretend you know me. You don't know me." I was wildly throwing bricks to rebuild my wall, sealing myself back into my safe, miserable little fortress. The sharp scrape of metal echoed in the tiny room as Rowan struck her Zippo lighter again. The yellow flame flared to life, violently aggressive against the absolute dark. I squeezed my eyes shut, refusing to look at her, refusing to let her see the devastating terror written all over my face. "Look at me," she commanded, the gravel in her tone turning into hard, unforgiving steel. I shook my head, pressing my face against my knees. "Logically speaking," I started, desperately clinging to my favorite crutch, though it sounded pathetic even to my own ears. "Logically speaking, the physiological response to extreme cold can easily be mistaken for, 'Open your damn eyes, Elena.'" The sheer force of her voice snapped my head up. Rowan was sitting exactly where I had pushed her, holding the flickering lighter steady in her calloused hand.
The warm light caught the sharp angles of her face, illuminating the cold, furious disappointment in her gray-blue eyes. She wasn't angry that I had pushed her away physically. She was angry because she knew exactly why I had done it. "You can lie to your clients. You can lie to your board. You can lie to the entire world," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She snapped the lighter shut, plunging us instantly back into the terrifying void. "But you can't lie in the dark." The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside, an oppressive, suffocating weight that crushed the air from my lungs. "You are a coward, Vance." The words hit me like a physical strike to the jaw. "You would rather freeze to death in your perfect little suit than admit you actually need someone." I opened my mouth to defend myself, to fire back with a highly articulated, razor-sharp insult, but my throat was completely closed. Because beneath the anger, beneath the panic, and beneath the freezing field, I knew she was absolutely right. I sat trembling in the dark corner, completely alone again, while the woman who could have saved me sat silently just 3 feet away. And for the first time in my spotless, perfectly managed career, I had absolutely no idea how to fix it. The silence that followed Rowan's accusation was a living, breathing entity in the room. It was heavier than the heavy steel door sealing us inside, and far colder than the storm raging outside. I remained curled into a tight ball against the freezing metal of the filing cabinet. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the absolute darkness. Minutes stretched into hours, marked only by the relentless, violent shuddering of my own body. The high desert temperature was dropping aggressively toward freezing, and my corporate armor was failing me completely. The cold wasn't just in the room anymore, it was in my bloodstream, slowly crystallizing in my veins. I couldn't feel my toes inside my expensive leather pumps. My fingers, tightly woven together in a desperate attempt to conserve warmth, were entirely numb. Every breath I dragged into my lungs felt like swallowing jagged glass, sharp and agonizing. And through it all, Rowan did not say a single word. She did not move to retrieve her heavy leather jacket, which lay discarded on the floor between us like a physical casualty of our war. She simply sat there in the pitch black, a terrifyingly patient apex predator, waiting for gravity to do its job. I hated her for her silence. I hated her for being right. But most of all, I hated myself for how desperately, how violently I wanted to crawl right back into the suffocating heat of her arms. "Logically speaking," I whispered into the dark, my voice nothing more than a fractured, rattling exhale. I didn't even know what I was trying to argue anymore. The familiar phrase was just a pathetic reflex, a broken record playing on a destroyed machine. A low, humorless sound drifted across the few feet of space separating us. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it carried enough dark amusement to make my stomach twist. "Are you really going to die on this hill, Vance?" Rowan's voice sliced through the heavy air, startlingly loud. "Are you going to freeze to death just to prove you don't need a single soul on this earth?" I squeezed my eyes shut, a rogue tear escaping and instantly turning icy against my cheek. "I am managing," I forced out, my teeth clicking together so violently it gave me a headache. The sharp metallic snick of the Zippo echoed like a gunshot in the tiny room. The yellow flame flared, casting long, menacing shadows against the water-stained ceiling. Rowan held the lighter up, leaning her head back against the cracked leather of the sofa. She didn't look at me. She simply watched the small, dancing fire in her hand. "You aren't managing anything, Elena. You are shutting down." Her tone was devoid of the playful teasing from earlier. It was clinical, detached, and utterly ruthless. "Your body is prioritizing your vital organs right now. That's why you can't feel your hands." She closed the lighter lid with a snap, and the darkness swallowed us whole again. "Next comes the lethargy. Then you'll just fall asleep." Panic,
icy and sharp, spiked through my chest, briefly overriding the numbness. "Stop," I breathed, my fingernails digging uselessly into the wool of my trousers. "I am just giving you the facts, Madam Director. Isn't that what you like? Data? Logic?" The gravel in her voice was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, restricting my oxygen. She shifted on the sofa, the leather creaking loudly in the dark. "You build these massive, impenetrable walls to keep everyone out," she continued, her voice dropping into a dark, intimate register. "And you do it so perfectly that you don't even realize you locked yourself inside." I pressed my face against my knees, trying to block out the sound of her voice, but it was impossible. She wasn't just in the room. She was inside my head, tearing down the scaffolding I had spent my entire adult life erecting. "You are so terrified of losing control," Rowan whispered, the sound carrying effortlessly across the black void. "But you have absolutely no control over this room, this store, or me." My breath hitched, a ragged, pathetic sound that completely betrayed my trembling composure. The cold was becoming unbearable, a physical agony that was slowly overriding my stubborn pride. The heavy, fleece-lined leather jacket was lying on the floor, just 3 feet away. I knew she wouldn't pick it up for me. I had rejected her charity. I had rejected her. If I wanted to survive the night, I had to cross the distance myself. I had to surrender. The realization tasted like copper and defeat in my dry mouth. I uncurled my legs slowly, my joints screaming in protest, stiff and agonizingly cold. My heels scraped softly against the linoleum floor, the sound deafening in the heavy silence. I didn't stand up. My legs wouldn't have supported me anyway. I lowered my hands to the floor, my numb palms finding the freezing surface of the tiles. I dragged myself forward, my pride shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces with every inch I moved. My fingers brushed against the heavy leather of her discarded jacket on the floor. I grabbed it, pulling it toward me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep my grip in the heavy collar. I waited for Rowan to say something, to mock me, to point out the total collapse of my dignity. But the darkness remained absolutely silent. I kept moving, dragging myself and the heavy coat across the remaining gap, until my knees bumped against the edge of the sofa. I stopped there, kneeling in the dark, my breathing shallow and erratic. I could feel the intense, radiating heat of her body just inches above me. "Rowan," I whispered, the name tearing out of my throat like a physical confession. She didn't answer. The air crackled with a terrifying heavy tension, thick with the unsaid rules of this dangerous game we were playing. I reached out blindly in the dark, my freezing, trembling fingers brushing against the worn denim of her jeans. I felt the muscles in her thigh instantly flinch and pull tight under my light touch. "I'm cold," I admitted, my voice breaking completely on the second word. It was the most honest thing I had said in a decade. "I know," Rowan finally replied, her voice a dark, rough vibration that sent a violent shiver down my spine. She didn't move to help me up. She didn't offer her arms. "What do you want me to do about it, Vance?" The question was a trap, a deliberate, calculated demand for total capitulation. She wanted me to ask. She wanted me to hand over the absolute control I had fought so desperately to keep. My heart hammered against my frozen ribs, a frantic, terrified rhythm. I slowly pushed myself up off the floor, my numb legs shaking uncontrollably, until I was sitting on the edge of the sofa beside her. I didn't retreat to my corner. I didn't leave a professional distance. I leaned heavily into her side, letting the full weight of my freezing body collapse against her solid frame. The contrast in our temperatures was shocking, a violent collision of ice and fire. "Fix it," I whispered, turning my face into the soft cotton of her t-shirt, completely burying my pride in her shoulder. "Please." The word hung in the air for a microsecond before the world violently shifted. Rowan moved with a sudden predatory speed that stole the remaining breath from my lungs. She didn't just put her arm around me, she enveloped me completely. She grabbed the heavy leather jacket from my lap and threw it over our shoulders, instantly sealing us in a suffocating pocket of heat. Her arms locked around my waist and my upper back, crushing me flush against her chest with a desperate, possessing strength. "I told you," she growled, her lips brushing directly against the sensitive shell of my ear, sending a blinding heat straight to my core. Her hand slid up my back, her calloused fingers tangling violently in the hair at the nape of my neck, forcing my head to tilt up in the dark. "When you take the leash off, you don't get to dictate how the hunt ends." The sheer dominance in her tone paralyzed every logical thought in my brain. I was entirely at her mercy, trapped in the pit of black burning up from the inside out. And as her thumb traced the frantic pulse on my throat, I realized with terrifying clarity that I didn't want the hunt to end at all. The darkness inside the back office was no longer an empty void. It had become a heavy, living entity wrapped entirely around us. Trapped under the stifling weight of the fleece-lined leather jacket, my universe shrank to the exact dimensions of Rowan Hayes. I was crushed against her chest, my trembling body surrounded by the overwhelming, radiating furnace of her body heat. Every single point of contact between us was a blinding flash of sensory overload. My frozen hands were trapped flat against her stomach, the worn cotton of her t-shirt incredibly thin beneath my numb fingertips. Her right arm was a steel band locked around my waist, pinning me so tightly that I could feel the sharp inhale of her ribs expanding against my own. But it was her left hand, currently buried deep in the hair at the nape of my neck, that held me entirely captive. Her calloused fingers gripped the shirt strands with a firm, unyielding pressure, keeping my head tilted back and my throat completely exposed in the dark. I could not move. I could not retreat. And for the first time in my existence, I had absolutely no desire to fight back. "Breathe, Elena," she commanded, the low, gravelly vibration of her voice traveling directly from her chest into mine. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until she said it. I gasped, a ragged, uneven sound that tasted like cedar, dust, and the dark musk of her skin. "I can't," I choked out, my voice sounding incredibly small, stripped of all its corporate authority. "Yes, you can," she murmured, her lips brushing the very edge of my jawbone as she spoke. The ghosting touch sent a violent liquid heat pooling directly in my stomach, melting the ice in my veins with terrifying speed. "Match my rhythm," she instructed softly, her grip tightening just at a fraction at the base of my skull. She took a slow, deliberate breath in, her chest rising forcefully against my palms. My body, operating entirely on a newly awakened desperate instinct, followed her lead without hesitation. I inhaled when she inhaled. I exhaled when she exhaled. Within seconds, the frantic, terrified hammering in my chest began to sync with the steady, predatory calm of her heartbeat. It was an incredibly intimate submission, a complete surrender of my own autonomic nervous system to her control. "Better," she whispered, a dark wave of approval rolling through the single word. Her thumb began to stroke the side of my neck, tracing the delicate line of my carotid artery with agonizing slowness. Every slow sweep of her thumb felt like a lit match dragging across dry gasoline. "You spend your entire life making decisions for everyone else, don't you?" she asked, her breath hot against my collarbone. "I have to," I breathed, my eyes slipping shut in the pitch black, letting the darkness consume me entirely. "If I don't make the call, everything falls apart." "And who makes the decisions for you, Vance?" The question pierced straight through my ribcage, tearing right into the exhausted, hollow center of my chest. "No one did. Ever." I was the fixer, the director, the immovable wall that everyone else leaned on when their worlds caught fire. The sheer, crushing weight of that endless responsibility had been slowly suffocating me for 10 years. "No one," I whispered, the admission tasting like a raw, bleeding wound on my tongue. Rowan shifted slightly, bringing her face even closer, eliminating the final microscopic layer of air between us. "Then let me make this one," she breathed, her lips hovering a fraction of a millimeter over mine. I was completely paralyzed. Every logical circuit in my highly analytical brain had been fried, reduced to absolute ash by the terrifying gravity of her proximity. I could feel the soft, warm exhalation of her breath ghosting across my parted lips. My hands, entirely of their own accord, slid upward from her stomach, my fingers gripping the broad, tense line of her shoulders. I was silently begging her to close the distance, to pull me completely over the edge and end this torturous suspension. But Rowan was a master of the lens, a professional observer who knew exactly how to draw out the perfect, agonizing tension before capturing the shot. She didn't kiss me. Instead, she dragged her nose slowly up the line of my cheek, inhaling deeply, as if committing the very scent of my desperation to memory. I let out a soft, frustrated whimper, my fingers digging forcefully into her shoulders. "Impatience doesn't suit you, Madam Director," she teased donkly, the rough gravel in her throat vibrating against my earlobe. She turned her head, pressing an open-mouthed kiss not to my lips, but to the incredibly sensitive skin just below my ear. My entire body violently arched against hers, a sharp gasp tearing out of my throat as the heat of her mouth connected with my freezing skin. It was a branding, a deliberate, agonizing claim of territory that completely short-circuited my nervous system. "Please," I whispered, my voice completely shattered, begging for a release I didn't even fully understand. "Please what, Elena?" she demanded softly, her lips trailing a painfully slow, burning path down the side of my neck. She was forcing me to ask for it. She was forcing the woman who never needed anyone to verbally surrender her pride in the absolute dark. "Just don't stop," I confessed, burying my face against her shoulder, my tears finally breaking free and soaking into the cotton of her shirt. The walls were completely gone. The perfectly curated Elena Vance had been entirely obliterated. I was just a desperate, freezing woman clinging to a stranger in a ruined gas station at the end of the world. Rowan's hand slid from my neck down to my lower back, pressing me flush against her hips with a sudden, bruising intensity. She stopped her slow torment and finally shifted her face back, aligning her lips perfectly with mine in the dark. "I'm going to ruin you for anyone else, Vance," she whispered, her voice dropping into a register of pure, lethal promise. I tilted my chin up, completely abandoning myself to the inevitable crash. "Do it," I breathed against her lips. I braced myself for the impact, every muscle in my body pulled completely taut, waiting for the devastating collision of her mouth on mine. But the crash never came. At the exact second our lips brushed, the deafening, violent howling of the wind outside abruptly stopped. It didn't fade gradually. It cut off completely, as if someone had violently severed the power cord to the entire storm. The sudden, oppressive silence that flooded the tidy back office was jarring, hitting my eardrums with the force of a physical blow. Rowan froze instantly, her lips still hovering a single breath away from mine. The heavy, aggressive tension between us shattered, replaced instantly by the cold, terrifying reality of the outside world bleeding back into our bunker.
Slowly opened my eyes, the adrenaline rapidly draining from my system, leaving me dizzy and disoriented. Through the crack beneath the heavy metal door, the ambient, eerie glow of the storm's lightning was gone. Instead, a thin, weak sliver of pale gray light was bleeding across the linoleum floor. Dawn had broken. The night was over, and the high desert was quiet. Rowan let out a slow, heavy sigh that sounded remarkably like profound regret. Her hand, which had been holding me with such possessive, intoxicating strength, slowly loosened its grip on my waist. The sudden absence of her pressure felt like a brutal rejection, sending a sharp, immediate chill straight into my bones. "The wind is dead," she said, her voice completely stripped of its dark, predatory warmth, returning to the flat, detached tone of a stranger. She pulled the heavy leather jacket off our shoulders, the freezing ambient air of the room instantly rushing in to fill the void. I was left sitting on the cracked sofa, shivering wildly, my lips swollen and burning with the ghost of a kiss that never happened. Rowan stood up, her silhouette barely visible in the weak, gray dawn light creeping under the door. "Time to go back to the real world, Elena," she said quietly, her back completely turned to me. And just like that, the intoxicating, terrifying spell was broken, and I was entirely, devastatingly alone once again. The heavy metal door of the bunker shrieked in protest as Rowan shoved it open. Pale, unforgiving morning light flooded the cramped space, violently stripping away the intimacy of the dark. I flinched, throwing a hand up to shield my eyes from the sudden brightness. The interior of the convenience store was unrecognizable. Shattered glass coated the linoleum floor like a layer of jagged, glittering ice. Racks of merchandise were violently overturned, buried under small dunes of orange desert sand. The store had completely gutted the place, leaving only a hollow, broken shell behind. Rowan stepped out into the wreckage without looking back. She moved with her usual effortless grace, her boots crunching loudly over the broken glass. I stayed on the cracked leather sofa for a moment longer, my body still trembling from the abrupt loss of her heat. The harsh daylight felt like a brutal interrogation lamp, exposing every crack she had forced open in my armor. I slowly stood up, my joints stiff and aching from the freezing night. I smoothed down the front of my ruined charcoal suit, a pathetic muscle memory attempt to regain my composure. When I stepped out of the back office, Rowan was already standing by the blown-out storefront. She had her vintage leather jacket on again, the collar turned up against the crisp morning air. She was methodically checking the lens of her film camera, her face an unreadable mask of calm detachment. "The highway patrol will dispatch plows at first light," she said, not lifting her eyes from the dial. Her voice was utterly devoid of the dark, raw gravel that had commanded my complete surrender just 10 minutes ago. It was the voice of a stranger giving a traffic update. "They should spot your rented sedan within the hour," she added, snapping the lens cap into place. I walked slowly down the ruined aisle, my heels clicking unevenly due to a broken strap. "And what about you?" I asked, hating how hollow and thin my voice sounded in the echoing space. Rowan finally looked up, slinging the camera strap diagonally across her chest. Her gray-blue eyes, which had held such terrifying predatory heat in the dark, were now completely opaque. "I told you, Elena, I'm a drifter. I don't stay in the wreckage." She slipped her hands into the pockets of her jacket, stepping over a twisted metal sign and out onto the concrete island. "I capture the moment, and then I move on." The words were a calculated strike, designed specifically to push me back behind my professional walls. She fully expected me to nod, to accept the logic of the situation, and to walk away with my pride intact. She expected the crisis manager to cleanly sever the tie and return to her highly organized, miserable life. And for exactly 5 seconds, I almost did. I stood in the center of the shattered store, gathering the familiar, heavy bricks of my emotional fortress. I was going to tell her it was a logical survival strategy. I was going to thank her for the body heat, shake her hand, and wait for my rescue. Then, an aggressively sharp digital chirping sound pierced the quiet morning. I jumped, my heart slamming against my ribs.
It was coming from my briefcase, which was still sitting on the abandoned checkout counter.
The storm had passed. The satellite interference was gone. My cell service had reconnected. I walked over and pulled the phone from the leather pocket. The screen was flooded with 52 missed calls, 14 voicemails, and a relentless stream of urgent text messages. The name of my senior partner was flashing brilliantly across the display, demanding my immediate attention. The tech CEO was officially a global disaster. The board was in a panic. The crisis required its director. My real life was calling, loudly and aggressively, demanding I return to the control room. I stared at the glowing screen, my thumb hovering automatically over the green Accept button. This was my entire world. This was the identity I had bled for. I looked up through the shattered window frame. Rowan was walking down the sloping concrete driveway, heading toward the deserted expanse of Route 50. Her shoulders were tense, her head bowed slightly against the chill of the morning. She was walking away. She was leaving me to my perfect, sterile, freezing life. When you take the leash off a predator, her own voice echoed in my head, a dark, vibrating memory. You don't get to dictate how the hunt ends. I looked back down at the flashing phone in my hand. The crisis manager knew exactly what to do. Answer the call, fix the billionaire, ignore the bleeding wound in her chest. But the woman who had shattered in the dark 10 minutes ago was entirely done taking orders from a ghost. I didn't decline the call. I simply let the phone drop from my hand. It hit the linoleum floor with a sharp crack, the screen violently shattering against a piece of debris. The ringing stopped instantly. I abandoned my briefcase on the counter, kicked off my ruined high heels, and sprinted in my stocking feet out into the freezing morning air. The concrete tore at the thin nylon of my stockings, but I couldn't feel the pain. I was running entirely on pure, blinding adrenaline and a terrifying new instinct. "Rowan!" I shouted, my voice cracking wildly across the empty highway. She stopped, her boot hovering above the asphalt, but she didn't turn around. I closed the distance between us in 3 frantic strides. I didn't stop to assess the situation. I didn't calculate the risk. I grabbed the heavy lapel of her leather jacket with both hands and forcefully spun her around to face me. Rowan stumbled slightly, genuine shock finally fracturing the stoic, detached mask she was wearing. Her eyes widened, the piercing gray-blue suddenly stripped of their defensive opacity. "What are you doing, Vance?" she demanded, her hands coming up to instinctively grip my wrists. "Your rescue is coming." "I don't need a rescue," I snarled, the raw anger in my voice startling us both. I tightened my grip on her jacket, pulling her down until we were forced to breathe the same freezing air. "I need you to stop running." Rowan let out a harsh, disbelieving breath, trying to pull back, but I held my ground with a desperate, unyielding strength. "I'm not the one who runs, Elena," she fired back, her voice dropping into that dangerous, defensive gravel. "You're the one with the corner office and the panic attacks. You push people away before they can see you." "And what exactly are you doing right now?" I countered fiercely, completely abandoning my polite vocabulary. "You tore my entire life apart in a dark room, and now you want to casually stroll down the highway?" I stepped closer, my stocking feet planted firmly on the freezing asphalt, completely invading her space. "You called me a coward, Rowan." I stared directly into her eyes, refusing to let her look away, refusing to let her hide behind her camera lens. "But you are terrified." Rowan's jaw clenched tight, a muscle ticking violently just beneath her skin. "I'm a drifter," she repeated, the excuse sounding incredibly weak against the sheer force of my anger. "I don't do permanence. I don't do messy corporate baggage. I watch and I leave." "Bullshit," I spat, the swear word tasting brilliantly foreign and sharp on my tongue. I let go of one lapel, moving my hand up to grip the back of her neck, my fingers tangling in her messy wolf cut. I mirrored the exact possessive grip she had used on me in the dark. Rowan gasped softly, a visible shudder tearing through her tall frame at the contact. "You didn't hold me in that room just to survive the cold," I whispered fiercely, my lips inches from hers. "You didn't look at me like that just to capture a photograph." I felt her hands, which were still gripping my wrists, suddenly change their pressure. She wasn't trying to push me away anymore. Her fingers were curling tightly around my skin, anchoring herself to me. "You fix things, Elena," she murmured, her voice suddenly entirely broken, completely stripped of its defensive armor. "You fix broken disasters. I am not a project you can manage." Her eyes were searching my face frantically, desperately looking for the inevitable rejection she was so used to finding. "I ruin things," she confessed, the raw vulnerability in her tone physically aching to hear. "I don't know how to stay." The admission hung in the cold morning air, a fragile, bleeding truth that she had guarded just as fiercely as I guarded my composure. I realized then that we were exactly the same. Two terrified women, standing in the wreckage, using completely different methods to hide from the exact same fear. I didn't answer her with logic. I didn't offer her a strategic plan or a beautifully worded crisis management guarantee. I simply tightened my grip on her neck, pulled her the final excruciating inch forward, and crushed my mouth against hers. The collision of our mouths was not a gentle, hesitant exploration. It was a violent collision of 10 years of repressed exhaustion and absolute, raw hunger. For the space of one fractured heartbeat, Rowan stood completely frozen against my sudden assault. The shock of it seemed to short-circuit the calm, detached observer she always pretended to be. Her hands, which had been loosely gripping my wrists, suddenly flexed with a brutal, crossing intensity. A low, jagged sound tore from the very back of her throat, a sound that completely bypassed my ears and reverberated directly into my bloodstream. Then, she took over. The drifter, the photographer, the woman who claimed she never stayed, aggressively claimed her territory. Her arms snaked tightly around my waist, lifting me completely off the freezing asphalt of the highway. My stockish feet dangled in the air as she crushed my body flush against her heavy leather jacket. I gasped against her mouth, a desperate, greedy intake of air that tasted intensely of cold ozone and dark cedar. She took the opening instantly, her tongue sweeping over my bottom lip with a possessive, territorial heat. The kiss was messy, desperate, and entirely devastating. My fingers tightened their death grip in the messy strands of her wolf cut, anchoring myself to her as the rest of my perfectly ordered world spun out of orbit. Every single logical circuit in my brain was permanently incinerated. I didn't care about the tech billionaire. I didn't care about the board meeting in Los Angeles. I didn't even care that I was standing barefoot on a freezing highway in the middle of a barren desert wasteland. All that existed was the heavy, frantic rhythm of her heart hamming against my chest. She walked us backward, her long legs eating up the pavement until my back hit the cold metal of a rusted gas pump. The impact was hard enough to knock the breath out of my lungs, but I didn't care. Rowan pressed her body entirely against mine, pinning me to the metal, leaving absolutely no room for hesitation or escape. Her mouth was a dark, consuming fire, demanding a surrender I was finally willing to give. I kissed her back with the same violent, unyielding desperation, pouring every ounce of my unspoken terror and hidden longing into the space between us. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, a chaotic tangle of limbs and heavy breathing in the pale morning light. When we finally broke apart, it wasn't by choice. Our lungs simply could not sustain the suffocating, oxygen-starved demand of the kiss any longer. Rowan rested her forehead heavily against mine, her chest heaving violently against my ribs. Her breath plumed in the freezing morning air,
mingling directly with my own. Her gray-blue eyes, previously so guarded and opaque, were now completely dark, dilated, and blown wide open with raw emotion. "You are absolutely terrifying, Vance," she breathed, her voice a raspy, broken vibration that sent a fresh wave of liquid heat straight to my core. I let out a breathless, uneven laugh, my hands sliding from her hair to rest flat against the warm column of her neck. "I'm a crisis manager, Hayes," I whispered, my voice completely stripped of its usual corporate edge. I brushed my thumb over her wildly beating pulse point. "I neutralize threats. And you were becoming a very serious threat to my sanity." Rowan let out a rough, incredulous chuckle, her arms tightening securely around my waist. "So you decided to physically assault me on a federal highway?" "Logically speaking," I murmured, a genuine, completely unpracticed smile breaking across my face for the first time in years. "It was the most efficient way to get you to shut up." She stared at me, the dark amusement in her eyes slowly melting into something so profoundly soft and reverent that it made my chest ache. She raised a calloused hand, her knuckles brushing gently across my swollen lips. "Your entire life is in that phone you just smashed, Elena." The harsh reality of what I had just done hung quietly in the crisp desert air. "My job was in that phone," I corrected her gently, refusing to let the panic return. "My life is currently pinned against a gas pump in Nevada." Before Rowan could formulate a response to that admission, a loud, heavy rumbling sound echoed across the desolate landscape. We both turned our heads, the intimate bubble violently pierced by the intrusion of the outside world. About a mile down the straight expanse of Route 50, a set of brilliant amber lights was flashing through the dissipating morning fog. The Nevada Department of Transportation had arrived. The bright yellow plow truck was leading a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck, carving a slow path through the debris. Reality had officially caught up with us. Rowan slowly unwrapped her arms from my waist, her posture immediately stiffening as she took a half-step back. The physical separation felt like a sharp drop in altitude, leaving me instantly cold and ungrounded. "Your rescue," she stated quietly, her tone attempting to rebuild a fraction of her old, detached armor. I looked at her, entirely unamused by her sudden retreat. I stepped away from the gas pump, standing tall despite my ruined suit and bleeding stocking feet. The Type A executive wasn't dead. She had just finally figured out what was actually worth fighting for. "Stay right here," I commanded, leveling a sharp, authoritative glare directly at her. "Do not move." Rowan blinked, genuinely taken aback by the sudden return of the boardroom director. She instinctively raised her hands in a mock surrender. "Yes, ma'am." I turned on my heel and walked bogfoot across the glass-strewn concrete to intercept the arriving convoy. The tow truck rumbled to a halt near the concrete island, the hiss of its air brakes incredibly loud in the quiet morning. A burly mechanic in a high-visibility jacket hopped out of the cab, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. He looked at the shattered convenience store, then at my rented sedan, and finally at me. "Rough night, lady?" he asked, scratching his bearded chin in sheer bewilderment. "You have no idea," I replied briskly, instantly slipping into my professional cadence. I pointed a sharp finger at the dead rental car. "The transmission is blown. The keys are in the ignition. The rental agreement is in the glove compartment." I rattled off a string of instructions with flawless, terrifying precision. "I need you to tow it back to the Salt Lake City depot. Send the final invoice and the damage penalty directly to the accounting department of Vance & Associates in Los Angeles." The mechanic stared at me, completely overwhelmed by the sheer force of my unyielding administration. Yes, ma'am," he stammered, pulling a greasy clipboard from his vest. "But what about you? The cab only has one passenger seat." I won't be needing a ride, I stated flatly. I didn't wait for his confused response. I turned my back on him, on the rental car, and on the last 10 years of my meticulously planned, miserable existence. I walked back toward the side of the ruined building, where a battered vintage Ford Bronco was parked in the shadows. Rowan was leaning against the heavy driver's side door, tossing a set of worn keys in her hand. She was watching me with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. "You really are terrifying when you give orders," she noted, the gravel in her voice returning with a dark, teasing warmth. "You should see me in a courtroom," I replied smoothly, stopping mere inches from her chest. She caught the keys in her fist, her gray-blue eyes dropping to my bruised and freezing feet. Without a single word, she reached into the back of the open Bronco, retrieving a thick woolen blanket and a spare pair of hiking socks. She knelt down on the dirty concrete, completely ignoring the dust on her jeans, and gently pulled the warm socks over my freezing toes. The quiet, incredibly tender act of service sent a massive, overwhelming wave of affection crashing over me.
She stood back up, wrapping the heavy blanket securely around my shoulders, her hands lingering on my collar. "My itinerary is entirely blank, Vance," she murmured, the casual drifter finally asking for permission to stay. "I only shoot on 35mm film, and I don't follow GPS." She leaned in, the scent of cedar and rain completely enveloping my senses once again. "Are you sure you can handle that level of lost?" I looked up at her, the woman who had effortlessly stripped away my armor, shattered my carefully constructed walls, and completely ruined me in a dark room. I reached out, my fingers hooking confidently into the belt loop of her jeans, pulling her hips flush against mine. "I am a crisis manager, Rowan," I whispered, a dark, incredibly dangerous smile playing on my lips. I tilted my head, letting my lips brush agonizingly slow against her jawline, feeling her immediate, shuddering intake of breath. "I don't just handle disasters." I looked deeply into her blown-out, predatory eyes, entirely ready to embrace the beautiful chaos she promised. "I own them." I slipped past her, pulling open the heavy passenger door of the Bronco and climbing onto the worn leather seat. Rowan stood frozen by the door for a fraction of a second, completely undone by the sudden, aggressive power shift. A slow, wicked grin spread across her sharp features as she slammed my door shut and vaulted into the driver's seat. She fired up the massive engine, the vintage truck roaring to life with a deep, throaty growl. She shifted the truck into gear, resting her calloused hand heavily on my thigh, a silent, burning promise of everything that was to come. "Where to, Madam Director?" she asked, her voice dropping into that lethal, gravelly purr. I looked out the dusty windshield at the endless, desolate stretch of the loneliest road in America. It didn't look lonely anymore. "Drive, Hayes," I commanded softly, "and make it an interesting detour. The road ahead is endless, but for the first time in my life, I have absolutely no intention of looking back. Every wild journey has to start somewhere. Where are you listening from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below and let's see how far this road really goes."